My name is Patrick. I use he and they pronouns, and I am just really touched at these times to be able to be in community with everybody. The POC Sangha is my home Sangha. This is where I started. The practice of mindfulness and meditation really can be much more powerful the more we acknowledge that we are bringing in bringing in larger pieces of our environment to notice. So that expansive, luminous mind practice is something that's been useful for me. So I'm going to offer it tonight. And again, if this works for you, great. If not, I invite you just to let my voice fall to the background and stay with the practice you're comfortable with. So I'll invite us to find a posture that feels comfortable and yet alert. Noticing how our breath is falling. Just acknowledging that it's really great just to be with each other. That there's a certain type of energy that's connected when we're all focusing our time and our meditation in the same space, even on Zoom. Just let your shoulders fall. Allow yourself to have a nice deep breath in and out. Noticing what it feels like to really settle into that cushion or that chair. I like to think nice flat feet on the ground. Really just feeling held by the earth and by the chair, the cushion. Just quickly scanning through the body, noticing any places where there's tension. If you can breathe in, breathe out, relaxation. Again, we're going to begin our meditation by bringing a single point of attention. So I invite you to use the breath, right? So noticing either at the nostrils as the breath comes in and out, focus your attention there. Or you may choose to focus on your belly as you breathe in deeply, noticing the expansion or contraction in your belly and chest. But find a place to hold your attention, and we're going to keep it there for about 8 minutes before we transition to the next place. So allowing yourself to have another deep breath in, out. Be sitting for about 25 minutes. Just noticing if your attention has wandered. Gentle invitation to bring your focus back to a single point of attention. Be that the breath. Noticing the quality of our concentration. If you're interested, inviting in a multiple focus point practice, which is to shift from the single point to multiple points of attention. Notice where your hands are. Noticing the contact between your hand and your leg, or your hand and the chair, ground, but alternating your attention between your breath and the sensation of your hand, whatever that feels comfortable. You can also expand and Shift your attention to the point of contact from where your butt is sitting in the cushion or the chair. Just notice what the quality of that sensation is. And shift your attention from the breath to the place where your hands are placed, point of contact for your butt in the chair or the cushion. And practice with moving your attention from place to place. Multiple points of attention allow us to practice shifting and recentering focus. Noticing if your attention has wandered, and inviting it back with your single or multiple focus points. Taking a minute to notice the quality of our breathing. And if it feels accessible to you, stepping into a luminous mind meditation, which is expanding from our multiple focal points to much broader, expansive noticing, listening to the temperature in the room, noticing any sounds that are present, continuing to notice the points where our body is in contact with the cushion or the ground, continuing to notice our breath, but incrementally expanding our consciousness and our awareness into our meditation to see how large of a container we can hold while still remaining focused. We'll do this for about 5 more minutes. Thank you. Just noticing the breath, I'm understanding my voice isn't carrying very well, so I'll speak louder. Paying attention to the pace of our breathing, I want to invite folks into a much more expansive way of bringing our focus and attention. This luminous mind practice is expanding from just noticing the multiple points of focus where our body is in contact with the chair or the ground, to including that as well as our breath, with noticing what is in the air, noticing the consciousness of our breathing, any sounds that are present in the room. The goal is to expand your consciousness so that you can notice as much as possible in the container of this space while also maintaining focus. So we'll take 5 more minutes to practice expanding our awareness in our meditation. In our last few moments of sitting together, I'm going to offer the practice of metta for ourselves, for our communities. So we'll start by, we'll offer these prayers aloud, and you may repeat them quietly to yourself. Taking a minute just to bring an image of ourselves into our consciousness, our mind. Paying attention to that image, we say the following prayers to ourselves. May I feel joy and the ease, even in difficult times. May I feel healthy, safe, and protected from both inner and outer harm. May I feel strong. May I be free. Now bringing into our consciousness the image, the idea of folks that we love, we know may be suffering. We hold them in our mind. We offer them the same prayers. You may repeat them to yourself quietly as I say them aloud. May they feel joy and ease, even in these difficult times. May they feel safe, healthy, and protected from both inner and outer harm. May they feel strong. May we all be free. So tonight we're going to talk about the third noble truth. And along the way, I mentioned some of the other noble truths, but the focus tonight is really about what is the end of suffering? What does it look like? How have we maybe experienced tastes of it, flavors for it, and in these crazy, difficult times, very difficult times, there's a lot of focus. There's a lot of attention being brought to places where we can practice and explore this stuff together. So I want to start by telling a story, which I've never done before, so I'm a little bit nervous, but I'm going to tell it, the story of part of the Buddha's life. So some of us know that the Buddha was born a prince and lived in a palace. What that looks like, we're not sure, but that his life was very sheltered. He lived behind a wall, and he often had musings and conversations with his father about what happened outside of those walls. And one day he screws up the courage to tell his father, the king, I would love to know what happens outside of these walls. I want to know more about what's happening in the world. And the father says, okay, we can make that happen. I'm going to send you with an attendant out, and you may see what's happening in the world. The attendant then returns to the king, and the king says, look, you must set a decree that I want my son to experience positive, pleasant lives outside of the walls. So please tell all of the people in the community, in the town, that we want them to be smiley and happy and laughing, so that my son will understand that there is joy not just within these walls, but outside as well. The attendant says yes. They take off on their first journey, and as they're going through the town, the prince notices there's laughter, there's children, there's people smiling and cheering. And then as he comes along, he starts to notice that there is a man who looks a little different than the rest of the men. He's got kind of disheveled white hair piled on top of his head. He's got kind of a crick in his back, and he's kind of like leaning to one side. And so the prince says to the attendant, please stop. So he stops the carriage and says, who is this man? He seems to stand out. And the attendant says, well, this man is one of the older members of the village. Oh, he's an older man. Like, what does that mean? He's older. He's like, oh, well, his life is, he once was young and strong and his skin was taut, but now he's older and he's not as strong. He's weak. And his skin is not as taut. It is wrinkled. And so he's an older man. His life is, his body the body doesn't last. And so the prince thought about this, and as they continued on the journey, he started to get very depressed. He said, well, take me back to the palace. So he goes back to the palace, and the prince is contemplating, what does it mean to be old? This is the first time I'm encountering this experience of old age. Then a couple of days later, he says, well, I want to journey some more. So he speaks to the attendant speaks to the king, the same process again, and they head out on a second journey. The second journey, they're looking, and the townspeople have been, invited again to be happy and cheery. And as he's noticing smiles and kids, now he notices that there's a man in the crowd who's making a funny noise. He's coughing. He calls the attendant, please stop. The attendant stops and says, what's wrong with this man? He looks so unhappy. His eyes are dreary, and he's making these weird noises with his mouth. And the attendant says, oh, this gentleman is sick. His body is starting to decay. He's succumbed to an illness that he may not survive, but his body is, he's experiencing pain and suffering, and that coughing is a result of this illness. And the Buddha says, well, does this happen to everybody? He says, yes, eventually everybody will become sick. And the prince becomes very depressed. He says, well, take me back to the palace. And they head on back. And as these princes, again, contemplating and understanding what is sickness, what is being old, and all these reflections, he, after a couple of days, he's feeling very depressed, but he wants to learn more. So he says, again, a third time, let's go. Calls the attendant, the same situation happens. And this time, as they're leaving the palace, they notice there's a processional, and it's a funeral. And the gentleman is wrapped in white, and he's being carried off to have his body burned. And the prince says to the attendant, please stop. I want to know what's happening here. He said, oh, this man has died. And they're carrying his body to be burned. He said, well, why will they burn his body? Won't he burn if his body burns? And he says, no, this is the body. This is the container for the spirit and for the soul. This is not him. This is just his body. It's no longer serving him. So the prince, very confused and very upset, says, take me back to the palace. And he goes back again. And his contemplation just gets very deep. What is it to die? And if we are going to be old, and if we're going to be sick, and if we're going to die, why even do all this? What is the point of it? And as he's having his contemplations, he hears from the attendant, there's great news. Your wife is giving birth to your son. So the attendant rushes the prince in to meet the new baby boy, the prince's child. And in that moment, the prince's heart just explodes with mudita, joy. And just noticing, looks into his eyes, and he sees the future, and he sees the opportunities, he sees the laughs, he sees the dancing, he sees it all, and he just is exploding inside his mind and his heart to think the amount of joy that this being will experience in life is so powerful that it is in contrast to the aged and the sickly and the dead. There is joy in this being, and what will happen to this being throughout its life. And ultimately, the prince later goes on to make another journey, but this is the story of the 4 encounters. They talk about the encounter with the elderly, the encounter with the sick, the encounter with the dead, then the encounter with this newborn baby. And it's a story that highlights some things that I want to talk about this evening. So that was my storytelling. Wonderful. So earlier I had asked folks to, in their dyads, express, why do we practice? It's such a foundational, basic piece of our meditation. Sometimes it's to understand, why are we doing this? Raise your hand or acknowledge if you're comfortable, if you think that you're going to awaken in this lifetime. I'm going to quickly scan through. Okay, there's a few of you. Got you, but not a lot. Majority, no. Right, so I keep wondering this basic question of, why do we practice? What does it bring to us, right? If the idea is that we will awaken, well, then that would be phenomenal, right? But many of us, myself included, I'm not sure that I'm going to awaken in this lifetime. And so my practice is really for multiple purposes. I think that when I ask people generally, what do they get out of their practice? I've heard stuff like, oh, it gives me spaciousness, or it brings me into time for spirit and reflect with myself. It brings me calm, right? And see, there's some of the things that I've heard when I've asked that question in the past, but there's so much more available to us than that, right? Within the practice, even if we don't awaken in this lifetime, what does it mean to awaken? The Buddha says that the awakening is like there's no longer an exposure to the hindrances, right? That in our practice, we sometimes will experience what's listed as, sensual desire that could distract us from our practice. Anger or hatred can arise, which is a delusion that keeps us from our practice and keeps us from enlightening. Sloth and torpor, or being fatigued and tired, and then doubt and restlessness. So in some places, the awakening or this enlightenment is described as like the ending of not just suffering, but the ending of these distractions so that we can be our whole being and selves without the restlessness, anger, sloth, or doubt, right? And so I've been having this contemplation about, well, is that all going to happen all at once? Like a light just goes on and all of a sudden it's all different? And I wonder if that's like, this feels a little bit large to me. What I'm much more familiar with are like moments of mindfulness, right? So I'd like to ask folks to take a minute and just, comb through your lived experience and try to remember a time that you felt very alive. You felt most grounded. Sometimes the way I describe it is occasionally when I'm teaching, I feel like it's being transmitted through me and I'm getting out of my own way. I think about times when I've just felt very like connected into community and very like, there was joy. There was very little doubt. There's very little anger or hatred. So just think into your history and your lived experience. Where have you experienced that? These moments of mindfulness and practice for me have created a couple of spaces that are really, really important to my life. Thinking about my ability to respond instead of react is definitely a benefit of my practice. Well, when I first started practicing, I was very wounded, and I came in very much like someone hurts me, I want to hurt them. Somebody yells at me, I want to yell at them. And it was just almost this like intuitive response that was just like, someone hurt me, I hurt you. And what I've noticed is that like through my practice, there has been an expansion in that time between like my experiencing something and my reaction. So someone may choose to hurt me, but I actually pause before I decide how I want to respond instead of just react. So I think it's important to think about in those spaces where, in your lived experience, you have these beautiful moments of maybe there's like very little or lesser suffering. Like, how can we expand them? Think about the way that mindfulness can increase the quality and the texture of those experiences. If you imagine being able to create spaciousness where, the experience that you're having doesn't just happen in that moment, but by reflecting on it and by inviting questions of understanding the conditions around what creates it, you actually are giving it space and depth to create a texture that you can even experience it even more deeply, right? To eat an orange is to eat an orange, but to eat an orange and be mindful of that practice and really taste the flavors and experience and the memories that it may connect with other oranges you've eaten. It's just the way that mindfulness can expand and really like allow a lot more depth and presence and texture in moments that we want to be experiencing. And then another way I'll point towards for the expansion of mindfulness is like in practice with Kalyanamitta or within Sanghas. I think that there are ways that I've had moments that I've been able to share, sometimes in this space and sometimes on the Alphabet Sangha, but definitely in the POC Sangha where we've had great joy together. The Black Joy Parade had a contingent of folks from this community. I think about the way that sharing an experience that is less suffering than most, or the joy that's available, the relationship between liberation and the end of suffering, and how that can be experienced in community, not just by the individual. Like the practice of Sangha actually adds another layer in the texture to having these experiences of liberation, and how beautiful to practice that together. So the invitation, I guess, that I'm offering is that, when we think about the end of suffering, is it this awakening that happens and everything is ever different after? Or is it possible that we're already experiencing the end of suffering in moments? In the moments of joy, and even sometimes in the moments of grief, but like, can we get to that end of suffering and liberation in just moments of our lives? And can we use our meditation and our mindfulness practices to be very present for those? I just want to share a personal story. You know, when they shot Jacob Blake, I had an automatic reaction because there have been so many. I know who I call. I know what I say. I know that I need to step off of work. I know that I have to have a certain conversation with my husband because it puts me in a mind state that is so intense and draining. And I'm in that space for different amounts of time, but I know that in that space, I am suffering and I'm connected to stories that are overwhelming around grief, around systemic violence against Black people. You know, I don't need to tell the story here, but there are so many ways that I experienced trauma in that moment that I have to lean into my practice. And I wish it was this thing. Sometimes my Aunt Mary calls me and says, like, oh, well, I know you're suffering, but isn't that Buddhism thing going to help you? Like, doesn't that make you like be okay with everything? It's like, actually, no, it's the opposite of that. It brings me in much more like focused, like presence. So I did. So I sat and I noticed all of the anger and the rage, and I noticed all of the sadness and the grief. And I noticed that, you know, I reached out to, you know, people that I usually reach out to in these situations. And I noticed that there was some love, that in the midst of all the grief and the anger and the frustration and the what now and the this is too much, there was also a feeling of love that came up for my people who show up for me in these conversations. And I would not have noticed that love. I would have been stuck in the rage, which is great, but I would have been stuck in the rage and I wouldn't have noticed the love if I didn't have my mindfulness practice. And that's one example of how the texture of an experience can be expanded and more focused, to easier to appreciate and access through our practice. So. We were having a conversation and I wanted to share this altar. So I'm on my phone showing the altar that my foster son and I built. There's a photo of me and my mother. There's some beads that my friend brought back from India. There's a shell my friend brought back from Dominican. There's some other herbs and spices here and a talisman. The lighting some point. Thank you, Ronald. There's my favorite talisman is that turquoise little bear there in the abalone in the middle. Yeah. Deep love and practice for even the smallest of gestures. So find share the altar, finding a posture that is comfortable and yet alert, having a deep breath in, out, another breath in and out. Then if you'll just go to like the most blessed sacred space that you can muster in this moment in your heart space. Take another deep breath from that space. Out. Acknowledging that our time together has been precious to all of us. It has impact in the world, and knowing the suffering that exists in communities that we are a part of, in communities of color, knowing that there is suffering existing in these moments in multiple places, knowing the suffering that exists outside of the walls of EBMC in the community of Oakland in California and in this country and in this hemisphere and beyond, acknowledging that that suffering is painful and that it touches so many of us in so many different ways that it can be scary and it takes real bravery and real focused commitment to show up to face in these dark and challenging times. It takes effort for us to really show up and be present for that, to not turn away from the suffering, but to face it and be present with it. And that when we take these Thursday evenings, we face these challenges and the suffering together. We acknowledge that there is suffering in the world. We acknowledge both individual and community suffering. We acknowledge the harm that has been caused to our communities, and yet we show up. We show up. We show up. We connect. We share our stories. We learn. We teach. We share practice. we connect. Yeah, we connect. And in this space where we connect, we just acknowledge that, as many people as were on this call, spending their time, energy, and practice devoted to reflecting on the ending of suffering, but that has an impact. And then that impact travel from our individual spaces into our community and beyond. May the impact of our practice together brings ease and power and comfort, and may it bring a just transition for all the systems that we need to shift out of and into new, beautiful spaces. So with that in mind, I dedicate the practice of our merit tonight to all beings in all directions. Okay. Thank you for your practice. Thank you for being with us. Thank you.